Hello, everyone, and welcome to my webinar on TRESA updates. My name is Mark Weisleder, and I'm delighted to provide this webinar for you today. Many of you have taken courses with me before. I've been practicing real estate for many years. I've written best-selling books. I've been a guest real estate expert on TV and radio. I'm quoted in all the national newspapers on real estate issues, and I've assisted real estate agents with RICO complaints over the years, and I'm a senior partner with Lawyers.ca LLP. These are the books that I've written. My real estate agent handbook has everything I'm about to discuss about TRESA, and I've also written a guide for landlords in Ontario that has also been updated for 2024. A little bit about our law firm. We continue to sign up all clients in a Zoom meeting so they don't have to travel. However, if a client is not comfortable on Zoom, we will attend in person to sign them up, and we can close a real estate deal anywhere in Ontario. We pay real estate commission the same way we pay our seller, the first business day after closing with an EFT, so there's no checks to go pick up. And for buyers, we have a trust account at every major bank, and so it's very easy for buyers to pay us at the branch or to just add us as a bill payment and pay us online. The closing balance, if you've referred a deal to us before, you know that we notify the agent as soon as the deal is registered. The client gets a full report on closing, and we provide lockboxes to sellers so there's an easy key exchange. And I'm available for legal support and advice. For example, I review status certificates before an offer goes in. I can assist with any landlord-tenant question. I also do wills and estates. I encourage everyone to go online to our website, and you can see our fees that we charge for every sale and purchase. I put this disclaimer up, and please, if you have any question, just call me or email me to mark@realestatelawyers.ca. So, overview, the major changes to the Trust and Real Estate Services Act, or TRESA, is that there's a new information guide that has to be given to a consumer before they make a decision what kind of service they want from the real estate agent. And it explains all the services. And then the consumer has to decide, are they going to become a client of the brokerage, or are they going to go it alone and be a self-represented person? The guide also explains the different kinds of agency, whether it's brokerage agency, designated agency, and multiple representation. The expiry date is explained, and you may have noticed in all the new forms, the expiry date has to be initialed on every listing and buyer representation agreement. There's an explanation about the holdover clause and the different commissions that you're going to pay, whether you're a seller or a buyer. Now, the guide tries to discourage sellers and buyers from agreeing to multiple representation, but they don't ban multiple representation. That's an important point to remember. So let's go through the frequently asked questions about TRESA. When do you give out this information guide? So you're supposed to explain it to a consumer before they make any decision on whether they want to be a client or go it alone as a self-represented party. And you should try wherever possible to get it signed by them, that they understand it. If they refuse to sign it for any reason, then just email it to them, text it to them, and just confirm that you reviewed it with them. So what is the difference between brokerage agency and this concept of designated agency? In a regular brokerage agency, as we had before TRESA, all the agents in the brokerage are working for the best interests of the client. Under designated representation, the brokerage chooses one agent, sometimes two, to be the only agent that provides the advice that the client needs. And that's the main difference. Now, you could have more than one agent listed as the designated agent. Now, for me, for many years, this is probably the way that most consumers thought anyways, that the main agent they were signing with was the agent they were always going to be in contact with. So just under TRESA, this is formalized that way. But remember, the listing and the BRA is still between the brokerage and the client. The brokerage signs all the agreements, including the confirmation of cooperation. It's not between the designated agent and the client, but it's the brokerage that makes the decision to appoint the designated agent. But as we'll see, the brokerage can still provide other services to the client, but it's the designated agent that's giving all the advice when needed. And practically speaking, what this means is that if you have a brokerage and they have one designated agent representing the seller and another designated agent representing the buyer in the same transaction, this is not multiple representation. And that way, each agent has no restriction. They can give advice to their own clients as if they were dealing with an agent in another brokerage. So as long as this confidentiality is maintained, you could have two team members act for both a seller and a buyer as a designated agent. Now, remember, you could still have multiple representation where you're acting for both sides, but the buyer and the seller have to agree. I'm asked whether TRESA applies to commercial deals. It still applies. So you have to give out all the forms. You have to explain all the forms, but in practice, as before TRESA, most sellers and buyers in commercial deals are very sophisticated. They just refuse to sign anything. They just say, bring me an agreement and I'll sign. And so for practical terms, the agents have to behave as before, but you have to give out the forms, prove that you explained it at least. But if they don't sign until you do a deal, it's going to be the same result today. Now, let's say you're in designated agency. Can another agent at the brokerage, who's not the designated agent, can they do an open house on behalf of the seller? And the answer is, as long as the seller understands this, that it's a service provided by the brokerage, it can be provided by this other agent. But you have to remember that you can't share any confidential information about the seller with the agent conducting the open house. They're there to show the property to any potential buyer. They give out information about the property, but that's it. So why are they doing it? Well, the agent could be there to perhaps sign up a buyer as a client, as many agents do today. And they're perfectly able to do that. They could even sign up a buyer to buy that property as their own designated agent, as long as all of this is properly explained to the seller. Do you still have to sign working with a realtor? And in my view, once a buyer or seller signs the information guide, they understand the difference between client and self-represented. But that's what working with a realtor is. They make that decision. Are they going to be a client or self-represented? So I believe that you should also sign working with a realtor so you know what the person wants to become. And then once that is signed, you can move on to the listing agreement or the buyer representation agreement if the buyer or seller wish to do so. So how do you explain real estate commission under the new forms? It's not much different than under the old forms. Is sellers and buyers have to understand what they're paying in commission, whether it's a listing brokerage or a cooperating buyer brokerage. So example, let's say you're reducing commission. If the buyer is self-represented, you have to set this out right away in your agreement so there's no confusion. And for a buyer, they must also understand that in most cases, you'll be paid by the listing brokerage. But if it is a situation where the seller is offering no commission, then the buyer has to understand that they have to pay the commission. Do you have to provide a schedule of services to attach either to the listing agreement form 200 or the buyer representation agreement form 300? The answer is yes. It's basically a blank page that you attach to each one. The form for the listing is 203, and for the buyer representation agreement, it's 303. So what do you attach? Well, many brokerages are just using the information guide, because when you go through the information guide, you see that if you're a seller, there are certain things that they can expect from the brokerage, and if you're a buyer, there are other things you can accept. So many will just put that in as the services they're going to provide to the seller and the buyer. But to me, this is your opportunity to shine as an agent. In other words, put in what makes you different in this schedule. So as an example, if you're acting for a seller and you create a separate website for the property, say so that you're going to do that. If you do special social media marketing, say so right in the schedule, because you want to advertise, frankly, why the seller should choose you. And with the buyer, you want to do the same. You want to do all the marketing and searching that you're going to do for the buyer. And as an example, as we'll see in bidding wars, they're much more complicated. And so the ability to provide strategic advice in a bidding war is extremely important. You should be putting that as one of the services that you're going to provide for any buyer. Now, let's say the seller or buyer don't want to sign a full service agreement. Are there other agreements you can sign? Yes. So let's say you're dealing with a seller who does not want to pay you commission. Well, there is a form to sign. It's called 216, where it says you're going to bring an offer and the seller can accept it, but they're not paying you any commission. So here you would be expecting to be paid by the buyer. If you want to get paid by the seller, you can use the form 230, which says that you'll bring an offer to the seller. You're not giving any advice. They want to accept it, fine, but they're paying you commission. Can you do a CMA for a seller who's not yet my client? And so, the issue here is that when you're doing a CMA, you're providing advice. And the regulations say you're not supposed to be providing advice to people who you are not yet representing. So let's just break this down, though. You see, most information in a CMA, the comparative market analysis, it's public information. So, that is totally fine to share. But now the question is, well, when they say to you, what's my house worth? Now you're theoretically giving advice. But remember, the seller invited you in, and, probably an implied agency is created. And so you have to be fair and honest with the seller, even though you're not getting paid anything for providing the CMA. In my opinion, what you should do is just provide a range. Based on all this, your house should sell for between X and Y dollars, but it's totally fine to do this. Now, let's say buyers contact you and they want to see links to upcoming listings. Do you need an agreement with a buyer to do this? The answer is no. This is public information. So as long as you have it, that they're requesting it, you can go ahead and continue to do this as well. Next question. Can you take a self-represented person to a listing where your brokerage is not acting for the seller? And under the regulations, they really don't want you to be providing services to people who you're not acting for. But the fact is, many of you got your start in real estate by taking buyers to other listings when they would not sign a BRA. Why? Because you wanted to demonstrate your professionalism and that you're on time always, and the knowledge you have when you're reviewing properties so that they learn to trust you and then sign a BRA. But you weren't going to get paid if they saw properties with you and then went behind your back and bought it. So you always had that risk that you had to be diligent, look after them, but you weren't getting paid. And so you see, that's the way it was before TRESA. And so now, if you do that, taking a buyer to someone else's listing, you still have what I would call implied agency, meaning you have to take care of this person, you have to protect them, but you're not going to get paid anything if they go and buy a property themselves. And so, in that situation, what I would suggest is you get in the habit of signing limited buyer agreements. For example, sign a buyer agreement for 24 hours that just says, any house I showed you in this 24-hour period, if you buy it, I get paid commission. If I don't buy it, we're finished in 24 hours. So now you have an agreement that covers this period and you don't have to worry about not getting paid. Now, let's say you do represent the seller and a self-represented buyer comes to see you. So the best example is an open house. So you represent the seller and a buyer's coming in and they want to deal with the property. So, you're allowed to show them the property, but now you're also allowed to assist with the mechanics of preparing an offer. So to understand, if a person comes in and you say, are you working with somebody else? And they say no, and you explain agency and you go through the information guide and they tell you, no, I want to be myself. I'm self-represented. So what can you do? Because remember, you're trying to get an offer for the seller. That's your job, to sell the property. So clearly, you could show the property to this person. And you could also, for example, give the person all the MLS information and say, here's all the information. You can go prepare your own offer. And then they could go and find their own agent. They can find a lawyer themselves. They can decide whether or not they're going to make an offer. Now, you could also complete an entire offer, get it signed by the seller, and just make an offer to the buyer. So as an example, you complete a complete offer as if the seller is making the offer to the buyer, and you say, here's an offer. You can accept it, you can make changes, go see an agent, go see a lawyer. You could do that. But also, you could prepare a completely blank offer that your seller would consider. And there's nothing wrong, for example, in putting in that offer that it's conditional on the buyer lawyer approving it within 5 days of getting accepted, conditional on buyer getting financing, conditional on buyer getting inspected. You're not providing advice to the buyer. You're providing an offer that the seller would consider, which is completely different and is completely permitted. Now, the buyer has to decide, are they going to go to a lawyer? Are they going to go to another agent? How are they going to deal with it? Now, so let's say the buyer, after you explain everything, you've given them an offer and they say they want to deal with it, but they don't want to go see another agent or lawyer. Okay, make sure you've done all the steps. Remember, you had to have explained the entire information guide to the buyer. The buyer has to sign that they understand they're a self-represented buyer. In other words, they're on their own. They get it. And then they have to sign the working with a realtor. Again, self-represented buyer. And if they want to do the deal, they can also sign the confirmation of cooperation as the self-represented party. So you can do all of that. In my although I recommend in any kind of offer signed on the spot, minimum, the buyer has a 5-day review condition for their lawyer, to avoid any misunderstanding. This is my recommendation for these kinds of offers. Okay, now, could you still act in multiple representations? So let's say this self-represented person comes to you and says at the open house, you know what? I want you to represent me. I like you and I want you to represent me. Now, it probably makes, you can do this, remember, as long as your seller agrees to multiple representation, you can then represent both parties in multiple representation. But for me, it would be much more preferable just to perhaps have somebody else with you at the open house and say, here, I'm the designated agent for the seller. I have a colleague here who's a designated agent for the buyer, and they would be happy to represent you just on this property. They'll completely protect you, and they'll sign an agreement for maybe 24 hours. And if you get the property, they get paid commission. If you don't get the property, you have no further obligation. So that probably is the way you should consider operating, especially if you're the designated agent. Now, what if you act for a builder and a self-represented buyer comes in and wants to buy a home? And so just to back a step, when you walk into a builder sales office, if you're buying a brand new condominium, you have 10 days to change your mind. But if you're buying a brand new home that's not a condominium, you can somehow be completely bound on the day you sign the agreement. There's no automatic buyer's remorse of a freehold home. And when you think about walking into a builder sales center, the offer is prepared. It's done. The price is done. All you have to do usually is put the buyer name, collect the deposit checks, and get their passport for the identification purposes. And so you see, the offer is prepared. So this buyer could come in themselves, self-represented, and sign it. And every builder's office is going to be different. So you're going to have to follow instructions from the builder's office and go through all the forms that you want this buyer to sign, similar as if they walked into an open house. And what I'm noticing now is that in builders' offices, they are, even for freehold homes, they're putting in a condition on buyer lawyer review. And I think one of the reasons is maybe it's the market. The market is not as good, but also, so that a buyer can't say later somebody said something misrepresented. So, hey, go to a lawyer. You got 5 days to change your mind if the lawyer is not satisfied. So a lot of people feel that if you let buyers make offers by themselves, it's going to be full of mistakes. They don't know how to do an offer. They're not familiar with the principles. They don't know how long to make for a title search. They could have the deal closing on a Saturday. So maybe we shouldn't allow buyers to make offers by themselves. And there's the other issue that a self-represented buyer can't just go to a visit by themselves. They have to be with an agent. Now, here they have no agent. Well, the answer is you cannot refuse any offer. Every offer must be presented to the seller. And yeah, it may have mistakes, but you could sign it back. There's nothing wrong with that. And, some are asking, do I need proof of an agency before I allow a visit or a showing? No, you can show the property if you're the agent, or your brokerage. You can have another agent show the property for the seller. To me, that's part of the services that you provide to a seller. Have there any changes been made to the law of disclosure? Okay, let's just review the main principle of a law of disclosure. If a seller knows about a major hidden defect that a buyer home inspector could not find, like a foundation problem, and it hasn't been repaired, the seller has to disclose this to the buyer. If they do not, and the buyer finds out about it after closing, they can sue the seller. That's the law. Now, the change is, if a listing agent knows about a similar major defect, they must also disclose it to any buyer or buyer agent. Now, interesting, murder or suicides don't have to be disclosed. That's the latest law. But this would matter to any buyer. Well, that's why good buyer agents find this out, and they put a clause in the contract that just says the seller represents there's been no murder or suicide or accidental death during their ownership, and then the seller has to tell the truth. When it comes to the seller property information statement, they used to cause a lot of problems. Under TRESA, you'd still have to say if it's available for any buyer, but really, don't complete it. If you don't complete it, it's not available, because that form just causes trouble for every seller, and I recommend it not be completed. Let buyers do their own home inspections. Have there been any changes to the code of ethics? A lot of the code of ethics has been deleted, and really now it just says, be a professional in the best interest of your client always. And to me, that's what it should be. In other words, it's not about, just staying out of trouble. That's how you build referrals, by treating people, always in their best interests. And that's what the code of ethics is about. Now we get to the new bidding war rules that a lot of people are asking about. So let's go through this. Now, people can still do blind bidding, where people, nothing is shared. Okay. And so what are the rules with blind bidding? There are no rules. That's what blind bidding is. For example, some people ask me, is there an automatic second round? No. The seller can do whatever they want. They can just accept an offer. They can deal with one offer. There's no rules. The seller just has to disclose the number of offers received, and they can't disclose the identity of a buyer. So that can still happen. But now we have a new form, 209, where the seller can direct the listing agent to share information to all of the bidders. So what could be shared? It could be the highest price, highest deposit, shortest closing date, and whether an offer is conditional or not, all things that matter to a seller. Now, you can actually pull different items from different offers. It doesn't have to all be from the same offer. And the seller can change their mind. They can say to everybody, I'm doing blind bidding. And then in the middle, they can switch to sharing offers. But they still have to disclose the number of offers, and you can never disclose the identity of any buyer. So how do you do this when you're making this disclosure? So let's do an example. You got 5 offers and you want to pull from different offers. So this is what you're going to say in writing to all the 5 bidders. And you can do this in a text. You can do this in an email. You just have to be able to produce this, that you did this. So here are the best terms from the 5 offers received. The highest price was $1 million. The best closing date, January 31st. The best deposit was $60,000 and no condition. There it is. And if you want to bid again, bid again. You don't have to bid again, but that's how you do the disclosure. So a question is, well, let's say a buyer doesn't want their information shared. Can they opt out? And AREA has given a clause for this, and this is the clause that basically says, you can't share anything in my offer, and if you do, the offer is void. So that way, the buyer is saying, I'm not allowing you to share my content. Now, you have to discuss if this is a good strategy, because this may not be a good strategy for the buyer. That's part of the job the buyer agent is doing, is giving this kind of advice. So let's say the agent gave this disclosure, $1 million, and your client put in an offer for $1,025,000, and they got the. So can you not go back to the listing agent and say, okay, prove to me you had $1 million. Okay, I gave you $1,025,000. Prove it to me. Well, you can't force the listing agent to prove it. You could complain to RICO, but RICO can ask for the offer, but it's possible they can also ask just for the Form 801, which doesn't have the sale price. Now, I have a feeling RICO will change that so that the agent does have to provide the agreement as proof. But remember, if you're the listing agent and the seller tells you to disclose the highest price, you keep that offer just in case you're challenged by RICO. And to any agent who's thinking of lying about this, you're going to lose your license. That's fraud. And that's why I say don't worry so much about this. I don't believe any agent's going to risk their license by lying about this, yet keep a copy. Now, let's say we have that buyer who says, you can't share my offer, but they're not the highest. Let's say they're the second highest. Do they still get content shared with them, even though they're not allowing? Well, to me, they would get their content shared because it's better for the seller to share. You may think it's not fair that, oh, I can't share yours, but you want the benefit of others. But because the seller does want the highest price eventually, that would be okay. Now, let's say there's multiple bidders, but you're charging a lower commission to the seller. For example, if it's a self-represented person. So, the commission is typically, let's just say it's 4.5% that the seller's paying you. But if it's a self-represented person, you've agreed to take 1% less or 1.5% less. You would have to disclose that to all the other bidders to say that one of the offers has a reduction in commission. So you might want to consider, when you're doing the commission agreement to begin with, to say, look, I may charge you less, for example, if I'm double-ending the deal. I may charge you yet less if it's a self-represented person. However, if it's a bidding war, it's just the same commission, no reduction. And that way, if the seller understands it right from the beginning, you don't have to disclose anything, and it's clear. What about discipline? What changes? Well, the penalties are higher. So it's $50,000 against an agent, $100,000 against a brokerage, and you could lose your license if it's fraudulent. So this is not a year to get in trouble with the Real Estate Council of Ontario. Just always continue to act in the best interests of your client. And so I hope this helps you to deal with phase 3. If you have any questions, of course, come to me. Now, there will be a phase 3 coming out later this year, and some are good things. For example, you're going to be able to call yourself a specialist. So there'll be courses to take. Maybe you'll be able to call yourself a condominium specialist. Maybe you'll be able to call yourself a cottage property specialist by taking more courses. That's a good thing. But there's also this potential of the province introducing what they call a resale cooling off period, meaning that every buyer under every deal will have 3 business days to just change their mind for any reason. Business days. So if somebody signed an offer on the Friday before a long weekend, they would have until the following Thursday to just walk away from the deal. Where did the province get this idea? It's the law today in British Columbia. And we're just going to have to work on this. They haven't had too many cancellations yet in BC. In BC, if you cancel, you have to pay a penalty of 0.25% of the purchase price. So if you made $1 million offer and you just change your mind in BC, you would owe the seller $2,500. So all I can say is you can expect that AREA and the people on the committees fighting for agents will push back as much as they can to try to stop this from happening. But I do believe, and I've always believed, that when you walk into a builder and you're buying a pre-construction freehold home, there should also be buyer's remorse. I've never understood that, and I even think builder lawyers, frankly, would support that. Finally, there'll be regulations and introduced about auctioneers. I've always had issues with auctioneers selling real estate unless they are a registered brokerage, and hopefully this will be dealt with in phase 3. If anyone's interested in my books, this is the table of contents, and if you want to order, you can just contact me at mark@realestateLawyers.ca. If anyone's interested in my landlord guide, same thing, just contact me at mark@realestateLawyers.ca. So that brings us to the end of the session. So I want to say thank you for everyone who's attended, and I hope that this has helped you to deal with TRESA. Any questions? There's my email, mark@realestateLawyers.ca. Have a great day.